Hello everyone! So if you saw our video a couple of weeks ago, you know we had another orchid show in our city. That, of course, we couldn't miss. And as much as it is nice to see the orchids being shown by the Orchid Society members, we also love to use these shows as a little retail therapy and look forward to new nurseries and sellers coming to our town. Unfortunately, sometimes there's some over-promising and some nurseries end up being a no-show, but we still manage to have fun and spend some money. We weren't able to repot these plants immediately because of yet another heat wave. Honestly, it's starting to seem less like a wave and just a permanent state of weather torture. And unfortunately, some of these plants are not enjoying the change in environment. We were excited that this Spanish seller was coming, initially not exactly because of orchids, but because they specialize in terrariums, and we wanted to ask them a few questions. But when we saw their display, we knew we were coming home with some miniatures. The first orchid we picked up from them was the Bulbophyllum ambrosia, that we used to have years ago, but it was a seedling that we unfortunately lost. One of my pet peeves at orchid shows are vendors that don't price their orchids, forcing you to have to ask the price of every single orchid you pick up. It's probably a sales strategy, but I usually end up being too embarrassed and not asking anything. This seller, however, did something different. They had pricing catalogs, so you don't have to dig for price tags in the plants. And when I saw in their catalog that they have a huge selection of Bulbophyllum orchids, and at good prices, I had to get at least one. I know most people who like this particular Bulbophyllum like it because it's one of the few nice smelling ones. But I actually find it interesting when they stink. So I picked this one mostly because the plant is compact, the flower is pretty, and the pseudobulbs are really cute. Now, all guides for this plant say you should avoid disturbing its roots. But I can't grow Bulbophyllum mounted, so I guess I'll have to disturb the roots. And just my luck, it's very secure to the mount. It was mounted with thin thread that's really hard to remove. And most of the roots on the sphagnum are dead, so the good ones penetrated the cork mount. I really don't feel comfortable peeling it off this last piece of cork, since it's where all the good roots are, so I'm going to pot it as is, even though I'm usually a stickler for cleaning new plants completely. I think like this, it's a good compromise between keeping it mounted until spring or destroying all the roots it has. Since Bulbophyllums have really short roots, I'm going to be using a repurposed shallow container. One of the issues I sometimes have with Bulbophyllums is keeping them potted. I just lost the one we had bought back in April, because it kept springing out of the substrate. Because the rhizome is very stiff, I added more sphagnum and I guess it rotted. To try and avoid that, with this one I'm going to be using small bark and sphagnum as usual, but then I'm going to secure it onto the sphagnum with some fine bark to make sure it doesn't either float above the sphagnum or get too buried in it and end up rotting. It still doesn't feel the most stable in the pot, but let's see if it does well. The next thing that jumped up from their catalog was the Dendrobium jenkinsi. I always found lovely the dark dendrobiums with bright yellow flowers and round lips, but when I saw on Fernanda's video how tiny this particular one is, it jumped to the top of my wish list. Still, after digging through their displays, I could not believe this teeny thing could be flowering size. But the seller thinks it could bloom next season, so at least it's not a tiny seedling. As you can see, in the few days it's been in our care, some of the back bulbs have yellowed. It does make sense. It went from a temperature-controlled high humidity display to insane heat and low humidity. I tried to compensate with watering, but most of the plants are struggling with the change. This is a winter rest type of dendrobium, so I was not going to repot it today. However, the temperatures are still so hot, and it is developing new growths, so I decided to at least see how attached to the mount it is. And then it came right off. A lot of the roots in the sphagnum were dead, and as it happens a lot when you buy young plants mounted, it was actually 3 seedlings close together. Most guides I consulted mentioned that it likes to be moist during the growth season. So I used quite a bit of sphagnum and added some of that fine bark on top, like I did for the bulbophyllum. It looks pretty good in the pot. I try to make sure the new growths didn't get buried, so let's see if it manages to pull through. I noticed on their dendrobium list that they had a Dendrobium rosellum, so I looked for it in the displays, and it is such a cute plant. Jay fell in love with the leaves, so we had to bring it as well. We forgot to ask how far away this one was from flowering, but since we got it mostly for the leaves, it doesn't really matter too much. Like the other dendrobium, this one wasn't attached to the mount at all. A lot of the roots on the sphagnum weren't good either. We couldn't find too much information about it online, but from what I could find, it likes to be watered abundantly, whatever that means, and then a little less in winter, but not exactly a dry winter. It also says the medium has to be very draining, so I'm going to use less sphagnum and more of that small and fine bark. It ended up being very easy to repot actually. And you can see that some of these growths are actually keikis. At least I think they are, since they have roots coming out from the middle. Next orchid we got was the Gastrocalus japonicus. We really like the Gastrocalus we already have, and I think that this one is the most showy one, I think. And if you look up the flowers, the little spots on the lip are just adorable. It might not be flowering size just yet, but they had one not much bigger with flowers on a display. Since we've been doing so well with our other Gastrocalus, I didn't even do my usual quick Google search on the phone before buying. Also because the place where this particular show is held is not the most convenient for that. You have no space to take a break or even sit down, which if you have mobility or health issues is not the best. It's also not accessible at all, but I digress. The point is, I didn't do the search and was surprised when I got home with care guides that indicate that this plant is intermediate to cool growing. After some more research, some guides seem to indicate that it can go up to 26 degrees in the summer. So it seems that it might struggle a little bit for us when it gets hotter, but hopefully it will be resilient and handle it well. This one has active growing tips on the roots, so I feel much better about repotting it. It's another one with a water abundantly, dry quickly, fast draining media type of care guide. So I'm adding very little sphagnum, but then compensating with that fine bark. I'm really using it a lot today. We had other plants from this vendor we almost brought home, but then exercised some self-control. Next we visited an orchid vendor that it's actually national, although not near to us. They had brought a huge Bulbophyllum phalaenopsis in bloom, and a Phalaenopsis gigantea too, that were amazing to see in person. Funnily enough, we usually go to them for this exact type of orchids, uncommon miniatures that usually come mounted. And amongst all the mounts for sale, I found something we've been after for a really long time, an Erangus punctata. It is absolutely lovely how freckled the leaves are. And the flowers, of course, are great. We love all the Erangus. But only after buying it did I notice that the roots have freckles as well. This one also has growing root tips, so it is a good time to remove it onto a different setup, but taking the newest roots off the mount was so hard. This mound is actually cork, not an aggregate, so these two roots went all the way around. And Jay had to hack at the wood until they finally came free. We've had success with our other Eranges in a quick draining setup, so we repeated the small bark and fine bark medium. This one and the Dendrobium jackensi were the ones that seemed more affected by the change of ambient. And of course, they were also the two I was more excited to get, so I hope this one makes it through. And that was our little haul. When we first got these plants, I was really excited, but soon after came the heat, and they seemed to immediately suffer, and I became a little bit disheartened. But today we got them potted up in their new setups, and hopefully most, if not all of them, will pull through. We hope you enjoyed this video and seeing our new plants. If you did, please leave a like and consider subscribing to our channel. In a few weeks, we'll have another orchid show happening, this time from a different orchid society. And if all goes well, we'll film some more orchid show content. In the meantime, we'll see you next week. Goodbye.